And first up, we have Professor Heidi Roop from the University of Minnesota, and she is going to kind of get us all grounded in kind of where things are at in this issue around climate change here in Minnesota. So welcome to the committee, Professor Roop. You can go ahead and start your presentation.
Let's see, it looks like the button was already pushed, so thank you very much.
I forgot, please state your name for the record.
Yes. Hi, my name is Dr. Heidi Roop. Chair Acom, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you this afternoon, especially at the beginning of what will likely be a very exciting session. My name is Dr. Heidi Roop. I'm an assistant professor of climate science, and I serve as the state's extension specialist for climate change and adaptation. In my role, I also have the privilege of directing a university program called the Climate Adaptation Partnership. We're Minnesota's leading multi-sectoral partnership, working both to leverage university expertise as well as place-specific practitioner perspectives to understand our climate risks in Minnesota, and importantly, how communities want to respond to those risks. I'm pleased to hear many of you mention climate change specifically, and your concerns map well onto what we've heard from Minnesotans loud and clear. We distributed a survey from the University of Minnesota to Minnesotans, and we heard a majority of Minnesotans, in fact 76% of Minnesotans, report being concerned about climate change. That's regardless of age, geographic location, career, level of education. There's a majority of Minnesotans concerned about climate change, but they also want to see things get done. Importantly, Minnesotans want to see reductions in emissions, improved access to renewable energy. They want to see improved and more investments in natural climate solutions and efforts that are preparing their communities for the impacts of climate change. They also want to see local, state, and municipal leaders in government do more to protect our state from the impacts of climate change. In fact, that number tops in at 83%. And I think it's important to note that Minnesotans also have hope that this will get done. Given the time I have today, which is not long, to dive into a topic which you can study for decades, I thought I might boil down some key points about the state of climate science derived primarily from the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports that came out in 2021 and 2022. These authoritative documents synthesize literally tens of thousands of scientific studies and are compiled, reviewed, and vetted by hundreds of scientists around the globe. Boiling down the thousands of pages of text, here are some key points that I will highlight in my remarks today. These are your climate change Cliff's Notes. It is us. It's here. We've committed to change. We must reduce risks through adaptation or preparing for climate change. And importantly, we still choose, but there's no time to waste. It's us. I'll just be clear, the science is clear, and scientists like myself rarely use words like unequivocal, but the IPCC states it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the oceans, and lands. And the rate of warming that we're observing today is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. If anyone wants to unpack that further, my background is actually in helping generate those records of past climate, so could certainly talk to you about WGGLS if you are interested. And importantly, we know the source of the problem. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane emitted from a range of our activities, from energy production, industry, waste, agriculture, transportation, and the built environment, are causing this warming. The good news? We aren't grappling in the dark to understand what's causing these challenges. We have tools, technologies, and increasingly favorable economic conditions as far as the cost of renewable energy is concerned to address these challenges and work towards a decarbonized economy. We also have a forestry sector in this state that is actively sequestering carbon and seeking to sustain resilient forests into the future to help offset our emissions. Importantly, no single sector bears full responsibility for these emissions. Every sector needs to embrace transformation. Some are better poised to do that more quickly than others because those technologies and the resources are in place. Others will take longer because there are jobs and people and reliability at stake. Importantly, Minnesota is leading the Midwest with its state's emissions reduction targets, which include reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. But we're missing our targets, and there's more to do to transition to 100% clean energy. As I mentioned, Jamie Alexander is here behind me, and she'll be testifying as well, and will be diving more deeply into decarbonization and greenhouse gas emissions, and she can follow up in greater detail about that. Also happy to answer questions after my remarks. Importantly, change is here. Average global temperature has increased over 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. For context, the targets set by the Paris Climate Agreement aim to limit this temperature increase to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. If you'll note, that means we're most of the way there. Current assessments of emissions suggest we're on a pathway to exceed this target of warming, with the costs and consequences increasing with every increment of additional warming. And change is also here in Minnesota. Our average annual temperature has increased by nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. This is already influencing the things we care about and rely on every day, from our roads and rivers to our lakes, stormwater infrastructure, and the health and well-being of our communities. Minnesota is warming, but this warming is not equally distributed across the state or over the year, as illustrated by the graph of maps showing seasonal changes in temperature that have been observed across Minnesota's landscape since 1895. Overall, we're observing Minnesota getting both warmer and wetter. Our 10 wettest and warmest years combined on record have all occurred after 1997. We've observed a 13% increase in the heaviest rainfall events of the year, and the growing season across the Midwest region has lengthened by nearly 2 weeks since 1950. Our average winter temperatures in Minnesota are projected to be more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century under continued high emissions. We also expect our summers to get hotter, and Minnesota is projected to experience anywhere between 5 to 25 days more per summer with maximum temperatures in excess of 90 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. You can see that illustrated by this map in the middle that is comparing change relative to 1981 to 2010. Extreme heat brings consequences for human health, for productivity in the economy. It creates material stress on roads and buildings, water systems, and other critical infrastructure. I acknowledge it's probably pretty hard to think about heat stress on a day like today where we're experiencing snow stress. But importantly, trends over our region show that these extremes in heat have not yet emerged, but we expect them to do so soon. All projections show that extreme heat will arrive in Minnesota in the coming decades. We have an opportunity and an imperative today to understand those risks and to prepare for those risks. Importantly, increasing precipitation that we are already experiencing has elevated overall flood risk, causing disruption to transportation and property and infrastructure. And we are already seeing and observing increased volatility in our weather extremes, with transitions between wet and dry extremes happening more quickly and more frequently across the Midwest region. We experienced the negative impacts of swings between extremes in many parts of the state between late 2021 and 2022, meaning we're experiencing these things already and having to cope with the costs and the consequences. And importantly, the impacts of climate change need no passport. Minnesota's thriving economy and the well-being of our residents isn't only dependent upon what occurs within our state boundaries. According to the IPCC, and many of the folks in this room can attest to this, weather and climate extremes are causing economic and societal impacts across national and state boundaries through supply chains, markets, the flow of natural resources, and this is occurring across our water, energy, and food sectors. The flows on the Mississippi River, as illustrated in this photograph from the Associated Press from this year, are a salient example of the costs and consequences of changing weather extremes. Sky-high fertilizer prices driven by weather extremes in the Gulf of Mexico in 2020 are yet another example of the direct and indirect impacts and costs of a warmer world. And importantly, as the impacts of climate change mount, so do the costs. The EPA estimates that the annual cost of maintaining current levels of service on Midwestern bridges in the face of climate change could reach approximately $400 million every year by the year 2050. The federal government also released updated projections in 2022 on the fiscal risks of climate change to the nation. From impacts to our GDP to the cost of crop insurance premium subsidies, climate change is costly, financially and to the health and well-being of our communities. Importantly, the extent of the costs and the consequences of a warmer world is a choice we still get to make. The more we emit, the worse it gets. This illustration shows you the potential global average temperature outcomes under different emissions scenarios. Of course, these are global emissions. But we know that according to the IPCC, with every incremental addition of 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming, it causes, quote, clearly discernible increases in hot extremes, heavy precipitation, and agricultural and ecological droughts. And you don't have to look beyond Minnesota's borders to see that we are squarely living in an era of extremes. Your constituents have had to cope with extreme drought and catastrophic floods, and both of these extremes back to back in a very short time period. We also know not all Minnesotans will experience climate change in the same way. Social, economic, historical, and political factors influence who has the ability to prepare for climate change, cope with climate change, and recover from its impacts. We need to center solutions and investments to addressing these inequities as we think about what constitutes an effective and invaluable climate solution or climate policy. Importantly, managing for these impacts is ultimately risk management. Managing this risk requires 2 things, and I can't overemphasize this. We need to both prevent the problem from getting worse, this is what we often call mitigation, at the same time that we think critically about how we prepare or adapt to the impacts that we know we've already set in motion. We have to prevent the problem from getting worse. We do this through tangible investments in reducing emissions and through effective management and planning to confront those changes that our communities are already facing and that we know will worsen with every increment of warming. Fortunately, we have plenty of tools in our toolbox to manage these risks and reduce exposure in our communities. We just have to use them. And as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about how to help Minnesota's communities understand their risks and prepare for them, we must reduce risk through adaptation. This is a statement also made loud and clear in reports like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Just as the science says it's critical to urgently reduce emissions, science shows it is urgent we work together to prepare our communities and economies for the impacts of climate change. From improved soil health, cover cropping, reforestation, to climate-ready storm and wastewater infrastructure, improved building standards, investments in public health and schools, public health and emergency response and disaster response funds and investments to support capacity, climate-tolerant crops, climate-adapted species. The lists of adaptation options and their benefits are long. Again, happy to talk to you more about those in detail. Currently, our adaptation efforts tend to be fragmented, they're small in scale, there are lots of have and have-nots, they tend to be siloed by sectors, and they're designed primarily to respond to near-term risks. We often know that these efforts are focused on planning and not implementation. Right now, with historic funding of federal investments passed in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, Minnesota could be poised to benefit from a multitude of mitigation and adaptation investments. But surveys of our local units of government show that lack of capacity and technical expertise are barriers to accessing competitive funds and other federal funding opportunities like the IRA and the IIJA. We need to bring community-identified projects into reality by increasing their ability to access capacity and technical resources to get that money, to turn ideas and needs into reality. These barriers are small investments that will help our state overcome significant barriers while reaping significant rewards, not to mention a very clear return on investment. So what do Minnesotans want? I'm not going to speak for them all, I'm one, but there are many. And many of them have contributed to the development of the Minnesota Climate Action Framework. We don't have to guess. Thousands of Minnesotans have contributed to developing a vision that outlines priorities from human health and resilient communities to natural and working lands, clean transportation, emissions reductions. And importantly, communities, farmers, tribes, and industries across the state are looking for practical, place-specific, durable solutions and capacity, and the resources, support, expertise, and safeguards to put in place their plans and needed improvements that will help them shape the communities and the thriving economies that they both deserve and desire. And finally, the science is abundantly clear that there is no time to waste. Quote, any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a safe and livable future for all. And that is a quote directly from the Summary for Policymakers by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment report on adaptation and vulnerability. So to be clear, we're confronting the risks of climate change today, and we need to focus on both prevention and preparation as we seek to position Minnesota for success today and in the future. And with that, I'd like to extend my gratitude to you for today, this opportunity, for the work ahead of you. And as a Minnesotan, I appreciate all of your efforts to sustain and create a thriving Minnesota for myself, my daughter, and all Minnesotans. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roop. And I initially was going to have both presenters go and then do questions, but we're doing great on time. So maybe what we'll do
The
is...
first time I did it all right, Chair.
You did great. You did great. And a table full of politicians kept it short for introductions. So both are working in our favor today. So if people have any questions, we can take a few minutes, and if not, we can continue with the presentation. Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Roop. This was a tremendous presentation, a good way to kick us off here. You had mentioned on the slide, climate change is costly, even more so with inaction. I think you said something about bridges, but I didn't see it on the slide. So if you could maybe repeat that, but then maybe talk more generally about our specific transportation infrastructure and costs, that would be helppful.
Yes, thank you, Chair Acom, Representative, for that question. So I can't speak in detail about the exact costs, but I can direct you the EPA in 2017, alongside the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment process. There is a 5th National Climate Assessment to be published this year. There'll be corresponding economic analyses and costs associated with that. That reporting happens in tandem. So our federal and national assessment process is ongoing. It's under public comment and review. You have till the end of the month to comment on that. We have a Midwest chapter. I can state specifically to the data that I presented in this presentation, the data that you see on your slide, those are published by OMB at the federal level. That was a White House solicited report on the fiscal risks facing the nation for climate change, primarily to the federal government. But when we look at the EPA report published in 2017 on the costs for the Midwest region, we are actually one of the regions with the highest projected impacts to our infrastructure. Part of that has to do with the amount of roadways in our region, in the Midwest region, so our costs are sort of disproportionate to other parts of the nation. We also are anticipating between 30 and 40% increase in spring and wintertime precipitation. That often corresponds to flood risks, and so a majority of the impacts on our infrastructure are likely to be tied to floods. And so we do top out with the sort of 400 million annually by mid-century on impacts, and that's just to sort of bridges. There's a whole unpacking of the different types of assets and infrastructure that will be impacted, but our region is compared to the nation, one of higher risk for our transportation system being exposed and the costs associated with that exposure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Eichel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There you are. Thank you for being here, Dr. Roop. You know, I have a comment that'll lead into a question. So I was going through your slides, you had some fantastic information, so thank you. You know, the first question, or the first comment that I want to make is, you know, the thing you said, and there was a slide on it, was climate change needs no passport. I couldn't agree more, right? And I think that leads into your next slide about, you know, making sure that the decisions we make are equitable. I mean, that's one of the big reasons that I wanted to be in this committee, because everything that we're going to have to do to mitigate what your research is showing is going to require mining, right? And I wanted to start that committee by making sure that it's well known. And the concern I have, and maybe the question is for you, is has the U done any research about what the acquisition of these minerals is going to mean for climate change on its own, right? And I mean that because the President of the United States, less than a month ago, just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zambia. I mean, you and I both know there's no labor laws, there's no environmental regulations. We're sharing that global environment around the world. So the concern that I'm having here is, we need to do something, but how can we make sure that we're utilizing what we have here? And is the U doing any research there and showing how just critically important it is that we stand up and we start investing in the mining that we have here in Minnesota to start making real changes in our world?
Professor Roop.
Chair Acom, Representative, thank you for the question. I apologize for this chair. I can't. I'll lean over here. That is an excellent question and observation. I can't comment specifically on University of Minnesota researchers doing that work, but there are certainly a range of researchers nationally and globally looking at what we would call a life cycle analysis, sort of looking at what are the impacts of, say, mineral extraction compared to continuing on with, say, a traditional fossil fuel combustion in the engine of a car. Let's say, for example, we know that as we build out and we electrify the system, we're going to need batteries and other technologies which are heavily reliant on rare earth elements, right, and other minerals. That then turn into these extractive industries that you're talking about that themselves have an environmental and a social impact. But they also sustain jobs and other things. So the life cycle assessment very clearly shows that transition has fewer climate costs over the long term when you assess the full life cycle of the impact. There is a lot of technology going into the actual recycling of minerals so as to reduce the actual burden of the extraction, because we have to, if we're going to electrify everything, there are certainly numerous barriers in the way to doing that. There are policy barriers, regulatory barriers, and then sort of the physical, we have to get the minerals and build the things. But those are all, and my colleague can comment in greater detail when she talks about decarbonization, but we also, as you point out, there are issues with where rare earth elements and other materials are being extracted from, and the regulations and the sort of environmental impacts and the very real human impacts of those extraction efforts overseas. And quite frankly, even here in the United States, mining doesn't have a great legacy in some communities. That said, it is going to be essential and part of our transition to clean energy. And I think one of the challenges of you all and your expertise and your role is thinking about how do we do that in a way that sustains economy, expands the ability to extract minerals where needed, makes necessary investments in the technologies that will enable us to use or reuse the things that already have been extracted. Part of that has to do with like batteries that could be used in one application and then they don't need as much energy, they can move into another application. We have a multitude of opportunities to mitigate some of the very real impacts that you're talking about, impacts to industry, impacts to people, impacts to environment. And it's a sort of whole systems approach. And I think that's one of the challenges with the way we've been talking about solutions, is that we're siloing them by sector and we're failing often to look at the broader context in which that solution or policy takes place, meaning on jobs, on people, on environment. So there's no question that we need to transition to clean energy. Part of that requires these elements. And we have mechanisms to extract those, but there is a much broader conversation to mitigate the impacts of those and to think about how can we more reliably look to US-based mining in a safe and sustainable way to create that and facilitate our transition to a clean energy economy.
Representative Weigel.
Thank you for all that. And, I'll just close the decisions we're going to make in this committee are going to, matter for generations to come. And I think it's something that we really need to think twice, maybe think again before we act on something. There's tons of study, even what you were just saying there. I mean, the amount of copper we need in the next 100 years to meet solar panel and electric vehicle demand is more copper than we've mined in human history. I mean, you can't recycle that. We need to mine it. And we need to be very well aware of it. And, Representative Hornstein, you made a great comment about disposal as well. I mean, we need to be thinking about this very comprehensively all together, how it all ties together, because I don't want to see Wyoming continue to turn into the dumping field of wind turbines. No one should. And I don't want to see them going over to Africa or China either. So when we have these conversations, I think it's really important that we talk about this as a global scale, because like you said, it's a global environment. Thank you.
Representative Hollins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you so much for this presentation. It's been really interesting. I think from my perspective, I have some questions about farming. And I mean, as a large food producer in Minnesota, I think it's really important that we consider how climate change is going to impact our farming industry. And I would like to hear more about what the anticipated issues there are and how we might mitigate them going forward.
Professor Roop.
Chair Eckham, Representative, thank you for that thoughtful question. Big questions and many answers, both in the solution space and the preparedness space. So no question, agriculture is vital to our state's economy. It's vital to sustain a global food system. We are a heartbeat in the globe as far as food on tables. And so there's no question that people are actually very thoughtful and thinking not only about the impacts of agriculture, which are very real in the emissions space, and there's acknowledgement of that from individual farmers to organizations that represent farmers and producers to many of the large multinational companies that call Minnesota home. So there's a very real understanding of those impacts and I think a sincere interest in understanding how do we mitigate or reduce the contribution of methane and carbon dioxide from the agricultural sector. Some of that is easier to do, some of that is harder to do. There are also really critical questions around agriculture as a solution. It turns out our soils provide great opportunities for sequestering carbon, and as we improve the health of our soil, we can improve water quality, we can improve crop productivity. There are all sorts of co-benefits that can come along with these natural climate solutions. There is a lot of concern, and one of the efforts that we're working on right now, thanks to support from the state legislature, is actually looking at the impacts of future climate on agriculture, relative humidity changes, crop distribution, the potential impacts on yields. We can see that even in present day climate, the Corn Belt is moving north and expected to move even further north. Our team at the University Climate Adaptation Partnership is actually supported by the Minnesota Corn Growers Association. We have an extension educator focused specifically on climate resilience and agriculture. And so they've been supportive of our program and helping add capacity on the landscape to think about food systems, their connection to agriculture and climate, and what do those solutions look like, and how do we ensure productivity and resilience across the agricultural system. And again, I could go have a whole presentation or multiple on this, and would be happy to talk with you or share additional resources if that would be helpful.
I was just going to say thank you.
And we're going to go to Representative Swedzinski here in just a second, and then go on to our next presenter. If other people have questions, let's hold them, and we can do that at the end. But we'll go to Representative Swedzinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question to the presenter. Appreciate the time you took to put it together. Just, we hear a lot about, from an economy standpoint, what we can do here in Minnesota versus what's going on in other parts of the world. What kind of impact, let's say we passed kind of whatever dream thing that as a scientist you would think that we should do to impact all these things that we discussed. If we did all of it, and what would that be? And then two, how much would that impact the temperature in Minnesota if we did that right here in Minnesota? Yeah.
Madam Chair, thank you. Representative, thank you. Again, sorry for this chair. I'll lean over this way so I can make eye contact. So the dream, rarely do I ever get asked to, if I could have infinite resources to do what I liked. But I think more importantly, what gets lost in, thank you very much, what gets lost in the conversation around climate and climate solutions is certainly there are costs. There's no question there are impacts. But we're confronting an amazing opportunity. And that is that climate solutions, when I think about them, it's not necessarily about a solution sitting in a silo. It's thinking about what is the public health system I want in place for my community? What is the emergency response? What are the services I want to rely on as a Minnesotan that are reliable and durable and going to show up when I need them? Those conversations, that development of a vision for what does our state look like? How does it operate? What is the heartbeat of our economy? At the undergirding all of that is a conversation around climate and what do we do and what does it look like in the future. So in that way, my response to you would be, I want a healthy, thriving state with a robust economy a strong education system, a place where my daughter wants to live and die because it's a place that she can thrive. It's a place I'm proud to call home. It's a place that sustains jobs, whether those are rural jobs or urban jobs or anywhere jobs in this new world that we live in. And so to answer your question, everything that we are doing right now, the way we're thinking about how to shape our communities, whether that's in this committee or another committee about our infrastructure, thinking next session about bonding, right? Climate and embedded assumptions about our climate system are inherent in all of those things, whether we're explicitly talking about them or they're implicit in our decision making. When we design a bridge or a road today, or when we decide how much tonnage a road can carry, there are assumptions about the climate system that go into the design of that road. Right now, those roads don't account for future climate. And so in that way, I'm not giving you a very compelling answer other than that I think I want what most Minnesotans want, which is a safe, prosperous, healthy place to call home. And in order to do that and all the things it takes to do that and create that, which you all help to do, requires us thinking more thoughtfully and critically about how we prevent climate change from getting worse while also preparing for it. And to your question around what do we do in Minnesota and is it a drop in the bucket and does it matter? The answer is yes, because if everybody chose to do nothing, we're facing a perilous world where we wouldn't be thriving. And certainly there are many other organizations, states, the nation, other nations, global entities, all working to deploy solutions. And I think, as I said before, no single sector, and the same goes, no single state is responsible for deploying all the solutions or assuming all the risk or the cost. But if we choose to go it alone or not go it at all, I can tell you the science clearly shows that the outcomes of that world are one that I'm confident you and I really probably wouldn't want to live in.
Representative Swazinski, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just trying to kind of digest that. It sounded, you had a kind of a lot on the beginning side of that, and then just kind of ended. So what you're saying is that we kind of just need to just do it, and this, from you're a doctor and a scientist, which I'm not, and I appreciate that about you. But so whether Minnesota did something or not, we just there's not like a scientific saying, well, because it talked about science, climate solutions in here, and when I hear that, I think, well, that's going to solve that, right? And so, so if we did all this, what your dream would be in Minnesota, it wouldn't make an actual scientific difference as far as the temperature coming down or less rain or less floods. Is that what I'm kind of getting from you?
Representative Swazinski, maybe I'll just say that I think that Minnesota has an opportunity to be a leader and that our actions will have impacts on those around us. And so while we are, only one state and a state made up of small cities and large cities and different types of industries, if we do nothing, then that's not a way out. And so I think that there are maybe some philosophical differences that some of us may have, and that may be. And sometimes measuring outcomes isn't as exact a science as we would all like it to be. But Professor Roop, any follow-up or any final answers? Or
Madam Chair, thank you. And Representative, thank you for that. And I will say that while I can't give you an exact number based on some policy outcome of if you choose to do this, then the global average temperature will decrease by a set increment. I can say with great confidence that every bit of greenhouse gas emissions that we avoid producing as a state and that we sequester in our rich natural resources, whether that's our forests or our soils, makes an important contribution to reaching global targets to limit warming and the costs and consequences of that warming that are very real for the rest of the world, but are also very real for Minnesotans today and in the future. And we talk about the future as mid-century. Most people alive today, and that includes Minnesotans, we talk about time periods of 2030s and the 2040s. That's not that many years away from now. And so we're talking actually about a future, our children's future, which many of you have mentioned today, but we're also collectively talking about our future and our lived experience, those of us sitting in this room today. So I think every action matters. Whether we can measure global average temperature decrease, that would be difficult to do, but every ounce of emissions we avoid certainly will accumulate towards a positive impact.
And our next speaker actually is going to be able to touch on this as well. And so maybe with that, thank you, Professor Roop, really appreciate it. And I think she'll probably stick around if we have more questions in that for her.